covering a range of research projects that I've been involved with for the past 8 years or so. I'm thinking that since I'm the new Associate State Archaeologist in town, taking over for the legendary Mark Hilkema, I wanted to kind of provide a little bit of an introduction about my background through this talk and talk about projects I've been involved with in the past, how that's kind of contributed to the arc of my career and my interests as a researcher, but also as an applied land manager working for state parks now. And so I'll kind of cover long-term research project, mostly archaeologically focused. I'm not going to go into a lot of heavy data. I'll talk more about the applications of the findings of this research for contemporary stewardship practices and resource management, things like coastal stewardship and prescribed burning. And then I'll kind of wrap it up thinking a little bit about ongoing projects, relationships between parks and the tribe, and things that I've been working on since coming into the district, and kind of long-term goals and vision for the cultural resource program. I think it's kind of timely that we're going to be talking about long-term environmental change along the coast. Obviously, we're dealing with a historical environmental event right now with this kind of combination of floods, massive storms, big waves, high tides, south winds that are all contributing to some significant impacts along the coast. And there have been a series of different environmental shifts and sea level changes and punctuated equilibriums along this coastline for many thousands of years. Thinking in the long range, I know right now it feels kind of like we're in a dire situation, but hopefully what's happening today can be used to contribute to this long-term baseline of environmental change and give us some sense of how to plan for a more resilient future, knowing that we're dealing with a system that's rapidly changing. I'm going to hop into this first component of my talk here in just a second. Let me get my screen sharing up. Just a moment. Let's get this in presenter view. All right. Does that look clear to everyone? Thumbs up. Excellent. Oh, you know what? This was...
Mike, you might want to play your slideshow though.
Yeah. Let me get that up one more time. Here we are. That's the one. Okay. We good? Is that the first slide?
Yeah.
So like I said, I'm going to be talking about applied historical ecology, which is using archaeological data, mostly zooarchaeology and paleoethnobotany in this case, to think about deep historical baselines of environmental change and human relationships with the environment, and how that information can be relevant not only for conservation and biodiversity management and thinking about resilience into the future, but also for cultural revitalization. A big component of this talk will be focused on the relationship with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band and their kind of key role as collaborators and driving our research questions. I'll talk about how the research team formed a little bit more as we go forward, but this is not just applications for conservation and environmental purposes, but also for cultural revitalization and bringing community practices back to a coast where Native people were disenfranchised. Since I'm not going to go super heavy into data presentation, I'm going to just recommend a publication that synthesizes a lot of this research that ties in ancient DNA, paleoethnobotany, zooarchaeological analysis, lithic analysis, ground penetrating radar, all sorts of geophysical data and information that's well synthesized in this recent publication in the Journal of California Great Basin Archaeology in 2021. So that's available via Google Scholar or JSTOR, or if at the end of this talk, I can send a link to a PDF of this if people don't have access. So to kind of get into the origin of my relationship to the Santa Cruz coast as an archaeologist and as a researcher, in 2014, I was a grad student at UC Berkeley working in Kent Lightfoot's lab, and we were doing some research up in the Point Reyes area, working with the Federated Indians of Creighton Rancheria, the Coast Miwok, and Southern Pomo Band up there. And some things happened in our grant cycle and with tribal politics, and we ended up moving our research project down to Santa Cruz, where there had already been established a relationship between Rob Cuthrell, who was a postdoc of Kent's at the time, and Kent, and the Amah Mutsun Land Trust. And in 2007, they had started an integrative historical ecological project up in Coroste Valley, looking at the impacts of fire through time and the use of cultural burning to maintain grasslands. This was a project that spanned several years and incorporated all kinds of interesting data from paleoethnobotany and paleoecology, using sediment cores and creating deep time projections of natural versus anthropogenic fire on the coast as a means of kind of looking at the frequency of fire return intervals that were likely anthropogenic, that were native people in the area were using to increase the productivity of grassland seed foods and different plants for basketry and cordage and building materials. This was a project and a research question that was driven by the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, and that was helmed by the fine gentleman you see here, Chairman Valentin Lopez, who's been working as the chairman of the Land Trust and Tribal Band for, over 2 decades now. At first, they were a little bit leery of working with archaeologists, knowing that we have this checkered past of often targeting sensitive cultural materials and not doing good faith consultation. So entering into this relationship was a slow and gradual process. And actually, there was a grad student at UC Berkeley, Chuck Striplin, who was also interested in thinking about what happens when you remove fire from the landscape. And he partnered with Rob Cuthrell and Kent Lightfoot to see, how can we get a deep time baseline of this? They learned a tremendous amount and a really interesting integrative project. And when I showed up in the lab, a lot of this research had already taken place, been published extensively, and part of this partnership between the Land Trust, Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, and state parks. A cultural preserve was established at Coroste Valley, where the Land Trust was continuing to manage and harvest traditional plants. But there was growing interest in coastal resources. And in talking with Val and some of the other tribal members, they were wondering if there was a way that we could implement a similar research program looking for analogous practices of resource management in marine environments. And so myself and Gabriel Sanchez, who's now a professor at the University of Oregon, worked with Tribal Council and the Land Trust to develop research questions, focusing on how we could look for evidence of management and stewardship and relationships to coastal resources. So we did a number of field schools. This photo is actually taken at one of our field programs. There's 2 of the Amah Mutsun Native Stewardship Corps working on screens in the back. For a little background, Amah Mutsun Land Trust and Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, many of whom you are probably familiar with, their territory spans a pretty extensive region from up around Año Nuevo, down to south of Elkhorn Slough, all the way out into the interior past Gilroy and down to Pinnacles. Upon Spanish colonization, a lot of tribal members were taken to Mission Santa Cruz and Mission San Juan Bautista. And following the mission period, many of the tribal members that were then displaced or fled the mission system further to the interior. And that led to a sort of disenfranchisement from the coast. And a big reason that the tribe was interested in this question of coastal resource management is because some of that knowledge was suppressed during the mission period effectively by lack of access to the coast. But Chairman Lopez was pretty stalwart in that, like, we can use archaeological data to restore what he refers to as dormant knowledge. Not that knowledge was lost, but it lies dormant, and lessons provided by their ancestors are present in archaeological data. And so we looked through ethnobiological databases, we looked through ethnographic notes to see what we could find about coastal marine resources. Ethnographic notes collected by J.P. Harrington in the early 1900s. And there was thousands of resources noted, but only 20 to like 25 coastal resources. So there's this huge gap in knowledge about marine resource management. So we kind of set out to see how we could detect that in archaeological remnants. Working with state parks, we did excavations at a number of different coastal sites, from Año Nuevo down to just a little bit south of Davenport. I'm not showing locations and information here because the tribe is kind of sensitive about showing map locations of sites, but many of you who have done work in this area are familiar with some of the coastal sites from Año Nuevo down to Davenport in the northern part of Santa Cruz County. Before we did any excavation or digging, though, we had this program we developed with the tribe that was geared towards minimal invasivity. And so basically we do ground penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, magnetometry, and a lot of surface survey to get a sense of not just surface densities of artifacts, but targeting areas subsurface that might have sensitive resources like human burials, and trying to avoid that while pinpointing features and things with eco-archaeological data that we were trying to extract and analyze to answer our research questions. So we surveyed 3 coastal sites and 3 upland sites, and excavated extensively at 5 of them. And this was all done part of 2 field schools over the course of the summers of 2015 and 16. We excavated not a tremendous amount. We didn't have a lot of aerial exposure, but we did a lot of bulk sediment collection. And so all the materials that we were taking out of the ground were being floated and analyzed to a very small size fraction so that we could get the most out of the least effectively. So kind of minimizing impacts to the site, reducing the probability of hitting human remains, and kind of extracting as much data value as we could out of each constituent class. We would do all of this work, at the trowel's edge, collaboration at the trowel's edge, as it were, with the Amah Mutsun Stewardship Corps. This is 4 tribal members standing outside the hole, my colleague Gabe Sanchez in the unit, and then I'm standing there looking like a train conductor with my hands in my pockets doing nothing. Pretty common sight out in the field in those days. This was at a site that was heavily impacted by agricultural plowing and Brussels sprout planting and growing over many years, but we found intact deposits, 130 centimeters down there that were dense shell middens with ash lenses. There's a couple other areas. This is an upland site we worked at with, these are 3 members of the Amah Mutsun Stewardship Corps and a UC Berkeley undergrad, screening at an upland village site. We were trying to see kind of continuity between the coast and interior regions and transport of materials and how people were moving around the landscape. The age range of these sites go, on the coast, we looked at a couple sites. One site that dated back to 6,500 years, had a kind of occupation to about 3,000 that was capped off at Sand Hill Bluff. And then more recent sites up in Año Nuevo, kind of spanning the last 1,500 years. And then these interior village sites were more in the late Holocene, the last 1,200 years or so. Now, all that material that we're excavating like I said, were floating and taking our bulk sediment samples and getting everything down to a really fine degree. So the light fraction materials that would float to the top of the floats would be, that's all the charred botanicals and small seeds. Rob Cuthrell analyzed all that material and added to his data set, looking at the use of fire to manage coastal grasslands and looking at different fuel types that were used and kind of reconstructing environment through that. Some of the faunal data of rodents was sent to UC Santa Cruz and analyzed by Dan Gifford Gonzalez. We're looking at presence of voles versus wood rats to reconstruct whether or not the habitat was open grassland or closed woodlands. We found a pretty high incidence of voles in most of the sites, kind of pointing towards the idea that areas that are now dense shrubby woodlands were more open grasslands. And then more relevant for my research was looking at all of the shellfish and some of the fauna remains. And we analyzed things down to a pretty small fraction, all the way down to 2 millimeters in some cases, looking at some things that are highly pulverized, but also some of the really small gastropods that are not commonly associated with dietary purposes. They're too small to eat, but can tell us some interesting things. And since one of the key questions that the tribe had was, how are we interacting with different habitat types, and how are we managing resources, or at least, continuously relating to resources, I kind of honed in on a couple different things during my research. One of which was the California mussel, one of the most abundant constituents in any coastal midden all throughout California. And we had a long durée, like a long time span of mussels present in these sites from nearly 7,000 years ago, right up to like 500-600 years ago. And so I developed a morphometric equation where we could look at overall mussel size from fragmented remains of mussels. So just measuring the hinges of mussels that are more robust and preserved better than the entire valve to reconstruct the size of the entire valve. And then thousands and thousands of measurements later, looking at the relationship between the size of mussels harvested and present in these sites through time and how those things change. There was some interesting trends in the data that revealed in the mid Holocene, from about 6,000 to 3,000 years, people were harvesting large to medium mussels, say up to 10 centimeters or so, like a pretty decent sized mussel, which we know now that the larger mussels, and people have known this for a long time, that big mussels maybe don't taste quite as good and produce a lot of the gametes that keep the population productive. And in the human behavioral ecology world, we would expect to see a reduction in the size of mussels harvested through time, kind of targeting the large resources and then tracking our way down to smaller resources. But an interesting trend happened when we started looking at the data from about 1,500 years ago to 500 years ago or so. And the cluster of the data was fairly tight in the size profile of mussels harvested. And we saw this trend of medium-sized mussels, maybe, 6 to 7 centimeters harvested seemingly in bulk. There was a lot of ride-along species like gooseneck barnacles and other mussel bed associates, not just mussels, but a lot of the associates that hang out in their habitat and are commonly found that you would expect to see if entire beds were stripped. And we saw this trend in the data where the size was smaller than earlier sites, but actually stayed pretty stable and even gradually increased over time, just barely. And it was kind of what, at odds with what we would expect from a human behavioral ecology framework, in thinking that resources would be gradually depleted over time and shrunk. And we started thinking about this, and some interpretations of that data were a a stripping method of harvesting and kind of a tenured cycle, like harvesting an entire bed of small to medium mussels and leaving the larger mussels and leaving the really small mussels that hadn't yet reached reproductive viability, leaving the larger mussels that were producing a lot of the brood stock to keep the population abundant, and harvesting the more medium-sized mussels that had reached reproductive viability, had the chance to spread their gametes, but were more sustainable over the long term in terms of long-term productivity. And so that's one way we got at this notion of kind of management of a resource. Mussels are interesting in that they're an animal, but they're kind of plant-like in that they're sessile and rooted in place and can be managed similar to plants. And surely they can be over-harvested very easily, but perhaps in that 1500 to 500 year range, with territorial circumscription and more pressure on the landscape and on coastal resources, people were developing practices which were sustainable in the long term, which were actually geared at long-term productivity and displayed some understanding of the population demographics of mussels. I thought was super interesting. And we've actually started applying that information to the tribe's efforts to go out and harvest mussels today. Another thing that we found in the much smaller size classes were these little tiny limpets. This is Ladia incessa here, the seaweed limpet that lives exclusively on feather boa kelp. And we know that it's very rare that you get preservation of seaweeds and seagrasses, and they don't have seeds. They're not true plants. So you're not going to get the charred remains of them. Only in really arid environments will you get preservation of seaweeds. We didn't find any of that, but we did find the gastropods associated with them when we looked down at these really small fragmentary size fractions, like the 2 to 4 millimeter class. In fact, if you compared the 2 to 4 millimeter class of invertebrate remains to everything greater than 4 millimeters, the amount of seaweed associates was something like tenfold greater. It takes a lot of time to detect these sort of small gastropods. These are Littorina and Lacuna genus snails that live on seagrass, on Phyllospadix, which can be used for cordage, which can be used for a number of different utilitarian purposes. There's also, it's a substrate for small schooling fish like herring and sardines to lay eggs and then adhere to the seagrass until they reach, until they hatch. So we were finding this proxy evidence of the harvest of seaweed and the harvest of seagrass in these really small size fractions. And it corresponded to the other zooarchaeological data of an abundance of small schooling fish and an emphasis on the harvest of small schooling fish that would have required nets that wouldn't be just, hook and line, which speaks to like a very engaged relationship with intertidal resources, harvesting entire mussel bed plots, harvesting kelp, and actually going out into the water to harvest things and not just managing things directly from the shoreline at the low intertidal zone. And so some of this information was especially interesting for the trends in the data, but what we were really keen on was using this for community outreach and for sort of re-education, revitalization of cultural knowledge and traditional resource management. And so we started scheduling these field trips, these coastal stewardship days, going out with tribal youth and young adults in the Stewardship Corps, and sharing the information that we were finding in the archaeological record, information about kelp and seaweeds. Here I'm, showing off some kelp to some of the youth camp, talking here with Chairman Lopez and one of the native stewards, Gabriel Pineda. It was on one of these days that we started planning, like we could expand these coastal field trips, these beach days, into an entire stewardship program where we're more consistently coming back and monitoring resources throughout the year to get a better understanding of what's happening today with all these resources. How might we begin to start interacting with them again, given climate change, given sea level rise, given a number of different modern ecological issues that we're facing. These were super fun days. We'd go up, we wouldn't just be, popping around the intertidal zone learning about things. We'd be playing jump rope and body surfing. And a lot of these kids live in the Central Valley, and, but their ancestors are Amah Mutsun, and they are Amah Mutsun, and they're still here and present, but their access to the coast has been significantly reduced by the Spanish mission period, contemporary high cost of rent and living, and just barriers in access and education. And so we decided that to make more regular visits to the coast and apply this information, we would develop a stewardship program based on cultural resources, on coastal resources. So I'm going to bring up that series of slides about that. And just give me 1 second while I switch over. Okay, are we on the first slide there? Amah Mutsun Coastal Stewardship Program. So this was kind of an outgrowth of that research, and we applied for a series of grants. I finished my dissertation research, and rather than going to academia or industry, I started working as a consultant with the Land Trust during the middle of the pandemic. And we worked together, kind of coming up with the key goals of the Coastal Stewardship Program, which was to restore access to the coast, restore health and resilience to the ocean and coast, and restore and revitalize traditional ecological knowledge and resource management. And in order to do this, we knew that, well, we might have had all this great information from the archaeological record, but the systems that we're working with have fundamentally changed in a lot of ways. And so we begin by just monitoring coastal areas, rocky intertidal zones, sandy shorelines, kelp forests, seagrass beds, freshwater saltwater interfaces at river mouths and estuaries, where we were seeing a lot of those type of resources from those habitats in the archaeological record. We'd figure we'd build a monitoring program around that. So every month we were going out and filling out spreadsheets. We were taking drone footage to get a sense of seasonal change in all of these different habitat types, tracking things like erosion and trash buildups and vandalism and all sorts of different things that impact coastal resources. We started implementing harmful algal bloom monitoring and kelp forest drone survey to get a better sense of impacts to kelp forest resources and timing of when we could harvest shellfish. One thing that I left out when I was talking about the mussel research is we also did stable isotope analysis to look at seasonality of mussel harvest profiles, which kind of correspond to what we see today, like more or less an absence of harvesting during the summer months, months that end in R, kind of the late spring to early fall, which is more commonly associated with harmful algal blooms and poisonous buildup in shellfish. And so we were trying to see, what the extent of harmful algal blooms are today, so that eventually we could get towards understanding these systems well enough that we could develop some stewardship protocols and then return traditional harvesting practices, knowing when things are safe to eat. So we would prioritize areas that had the coastal resources present and displayed in archaeological sites, also that were adjacent to archaeological sites. There's obviously a lot of coastal sites from Año Nuevo all the way down to Elkhorn Slough. And so we go out to different areas, and I'll kind of run through the list of areas that we would visit here in just a moment. In addition to this, we also started doing some additional projects like environmental DNA sampling for salmonids and ancient DNA of salmonids. So looking at salmon remains from archaeological sites from San Francisco Bay all the way down to Monterey, and doing ancient DNA analysis to differentiate between coho and steelhead and see if their biogeography and protection zones that are now, kind of well documented and defined by California Department of Fish and Wildlife today correspond to the ancient biogeographic range of coho and steelhead. So are we managing these fisheries properly based on where fish had a historical migration extent? And that's still kind of an ongoing project, but it's been interesting to integrate more, modern ecology with ancient biogeography studies. One other thing I failed to mention about this program, Amah Mutsun is a partner, as a founding partner of the Tribal Marine Steward Network, which has provided the funds for the development of this program. And so that's a few other tribes on the northern coast of California, the Tolowa Dini, Kashayapomo, and Rezagini Rancheria. These are all tribes that are working for these same common goals, kind of restoring access to the coast, increasing presence, increasing monitoring, and bringing back traditional management practices to address contemporary ecological issues. So we'll start kind of north to south. We did a series of surveys at Año Nuevo, where there's an abundance of prehistoric archaeological sites. There's also a vast network of kelp forests, which are probably pretty heavily impacted by these recent storms, and marine mammals, and actually more recent ecological changes there that are impacting the area in different ways, with the presence of elephant seals becoming very abundant in the past century, and really since the 1960s and 70s. And these elephant seals have a great impact on the archaeological sites, as well as sea level rise and increased wave pressure. So the sites out there are very endangered in a lot of ways. There's sites that no longer exist that were there just a couple decades ago. And part of my current role with state parks is and becoming more relevant and necessary in the coming year is to maintain an inventory of these coastal sites that are disappearing. This is kind of where we started. And then we worked down towards Laguna Creek and Sandhill Bluff. There's a large archaeological site that we worked on for that dissertation work up on the bluff. But there's also a whole range of different ecological resources. There's a freshwater saltwater lagoon, abundant rocky intertidal zone, and sandy shore. There's a creek that bears steelhead, and there along this creek, Laguna Creek, that spans a pretty vast watershed up into the uplands. There's a whole archaeological district of sites off of the creek that we've done a fair amount of work on. So this is kind of a central focal point of doing consistent monitoring for algal blooms, for salmonid environmental DNA, for impacts to archaeological sites and erosions at Sandhill Bluff, and buildup of trash. There's some dune habitat there, which is, rapidly disappearing habitat type on the California coast. So this is one of our kind of hallmark sites. There's this other area down here near Davenport, at the mouth of San Vicente Creek, where Amah Mutsun Land Trust over the past couple of years worked on a dam removal project at Mill Creek Dam. There was a buildup of sediment. There was this old defunct dam that was barring the upstream movement of salmonids. So we worked with Semper Virens Fund and a few other folks to get that dam removed, and have been doing environmental DNA sampling and up the creek and all the way down to the river mouth where it meets the ocean, to kind of get a sense of the extent of movement of salmonids now. And it's been a success story. We've seen coho in the creek for the first time in decades, moving up past where the dam was removed. And this is an area the Land Trust continues to go back and monitor and survey. Let's pop on down to the next one. This is Mill Creek, what I was talking about, the area where we're doing that eDNA sampling. Another component of some of this work is integrative cultural resource survey, which is basically what we're doing on all these sites. We're looking at archaeological resources, and we're looking at cultural resources. So culturally important plants, culturally important animals, and also abiotic things like springs, rock shelters, view sheds, kind of taking a comprehensive view at landscape, a more holistic view at landscape, and thinking about cultural landscapes as a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. Next zone, down all the way down in Moss Landing, looking at a very modified environment with the harbor and the jetty system established there that really has changed a lot of things in Elkhorn Slough, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is kind of another area where we look at runoff from boats, the abundance of sea mammals, the presence of otters and nesting birds migrating throughout the year, just to have another kind of sandy shore habitat off of the jetty to look at as well. And then finally, Elkhorn Slough, which is a really interesting area. There's archaeologically understudied and has been surveyed by a few different waves of folks from the 50s to more recently, 5 years ago. Myself and UC Berkeley PhD candidate Alec Apodaca did a survey of a couple dozen sites out there, and just tracking down old sites that hadn't been excavated that were kind of in danger of erosion from sea level rise. We'd return to these areas that we had mapped out with the Stewardship Corps to look at archaeological impacts, and also kind of more focusing on things of cultural resource interest, like nesting bird habitat and feathers for regalia. So we go out there to a eucalyptus grove where a lot of egrets and herons nest and drop their feathers and collect feathers for tribal use for ceremony and traditional regalia. We also do monitoring of sea otters, working with the folks at Elkhorn Slough National Estuary and Research Reserve, who are now also partnered with Amah Mutsun. Do monitoring of eelgrass beds, which are important for herring roe and the laying of herring eggs, and also just maintaining the habitat structure of the floor of the slough and preventing erosion. And there's also a project that Amah Mutsun is working on now, trying to restore native oysters, the Olympia oyster, Ostrea lurida, in this area, trying to outplant them and propagate them. There's not a tremendous amount of evidence of Ostrea lurida in the archaeological assemblages from Elkhorn Slough, so maybe this isn't the most directly applied component of the research, but it's interesting all the same. I'm going to thank all the people that I worked with on these projects: Amah Mutsun Land Trust, the National Science Foundation for providing the grants, California State Parks for giving us access to a lot of these areas, UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz. Then just a couple things before I time out here. We're almost at 7:45. Thank you, of course, for being here and listening to me run through all of this information. I want to talk just shortly about how I hope to bring this kind of integrative approach to cultural resource management and survey, and to work with Santa Cruz State Parks and the Amah Mutsun and the broader community as a whole. I hope to build and develop a program that takes a comprehensive and holistic view at cultural resources and doesn't think about things in a kind of static way, and incorporates natural resources and has a contemporary relevance of archaeological data that has a forward-facing, resilience-based kind of narrative where we can learn lessons from the past and apply them to the present management protocols, and work with natural resource agencies and work with land managers to sort of build in this long-term baseline of environmental change and respond to events like the ones that are happening right now. Like, I think we're going to see an increased frequency of high energy storms. We're going to continue to see the loss of kelp forests from these high frequency storms, from the imbalanced trophic ecology of driven by the absence of otters from historic overhunting. We're going to continue to see increasingly high tides and sea level rise impact, further impacting tidal fluctuation and surges on coastal zones. And to the early points in this talk, we're also going to be dealing with fire in a much more real way, as we all found out just a couple of years ago. The incidence of lightning caused fires is pretty low on the coast. It can happen, and just like the incidence of a perfect storm of rain and swell and tides and wind can all come together and create the scenarios that have led to a lot of destruction on our coastline. But I don't think we necessarily need to see this as doomsday predictions for how bad things are going to get. I think that we can see them as opportunities for learning from historical environmental events and building in longer term resilience into our management protocols, and doing that in a holistic way, talking across agencies to folks like Sempervirent and Peninsular Open Space Trust to have continuity in the way we manage resources, talking with tribal groups to get information from people who have long-standing ties to environment and a lot of really useful wisdom about environmental change and how it can impact people over time, and also develop some sophisticated management practices through time. And so that's one component of what I aim to, continue integrating into the program here at Santa Cruz State Parks. And I look forward to working with folks in the Santa Cruz Archaeological Society and community members at large on a number of different fun projects that we have, whether it's survey, doing collections management projects. We certainly have a lot of research potential in the collections facility at Henry Cowell, and a lot of collections that Mark Hilkema and many members of Santa Cruz Archaeological Society worked on excavating over the past few decades, and volunteer opportunities that will be emerging. And I intend to stay active and try to keep everyone posted as things come up in projects of mutual interest, and that present volunteer opportunities and cool training opportunities that come about. So just been here a year and I'm still getting my feet wet and figuring things out and figuring out all the joys of working for the state and how to get the ball rolling. I look forward to talking with you all more and being here for a long time and keeping the ball rolling. So thank you all so much for taking the time, giving me the floor. And if you have any questions, comments, critiques, I'm open to them all.
Yay, thank you, Mike. Let's give him a big round of applause. And I do see there are a couple of questions in the chat. One of them, I don't know if you see them, Michael, is shell collecting part of hunting or gathering? Is there division of labor between men and women? And also, has there been vertical coring to determine change of midden composition?
Yeah, these are great questions. The first one, tomato. I suppose it really depends on how you're thinking for the first component of that question. Is it part of hunting or gathering? I think of things like harvesting sessile mollusks like mussels as more of a gathering activity, in that they're staying in the same place and they can be returned to frequently and they're not going to move around too much. They're predictable. Whereas other things like abalone, especially when you start getting into the lower intertidal zone and perhaps even have to dive for abalone and other lower intertidal invertebrates. I've done a bit of that in my life, and I think of it feels a lot more like hunting than gathering. It feels like you're in the trophic web for certain. And I know there has been evidence of, on the northern Santa Cruz coast, skeletal remains with diver's ear in one of the individuals. So I think people were spending time in the water. I think if you're entering into the food web, maybe we can qualify that as hunting. And in my conversations with the Land Trust about the division of labor between men and women for shell collecting and harvesting, most of the knowledge that I've gained from tribal elders suggests that, yeah, that mussel harvesting and shellfish harvesting was part of a community effort, but largely like net fishing was a more of a male activity, and shellfishing and was done by women and children. But I don't know that that always, that's a hard and fast rule, especially with Amah Mutsun, wherein there's not this continuity in traditional ecological knowledge of the actual, like the carrying out of this process. There are a few elder tribal members who speak to their experiences, but it's been a question that's kind of hard to address in this area because we don't have that ethnographic continuity. And then for the second part of the second question, has there been vertical coring to determine change in midden composition? Yeah, at many of these sites, we've done profile samples, augers, we've done micromorphology in some of the sites to look at kind of small scale compositional changes. There's also been sediment cores done in a few different like sag pond areas along the northern Santa Cruz coast to look at paleoecological change and palynological change, like pollen core changes, and how they correspond to environmental change over time. So yeah, for most of this research, there's augers and profiles and column samples taken, and all of the excavation units have pretty well established profiles drawn up. And like I said, a lot of that data presentation would be found in that initial article I referred in the first place, and in the second slide of the first part of the talk. Second question, if the skeletal remains were sexed. Yeah, in talking, so I haven't seen this this individual, I haven't seen the remains, but Mark Okuma and confirmed through, I think Diane Gifford Gonzalez analyzed the skeleton, and that it was a female. So that could speak to division of labor between hunting, gathering, or shellfish collecting. Question popping up here. After spending so much time in the lab sorting shells, Dr. Grone have a favorite gastropod? Oh, that's a good question. It's tough. It's tough. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time looking at old dead snails. I think the seaweed limpet is my favorite, in that I remember the first time I had seen a lot of them turning up in the assemblage. There was a lot of different limpets in the smaller size fractions, and it's hard to get good comparative collections for limpets because they look fairly similar. There are diagnostic qualities to them, but when they're old and weathered in archaeological assemblages, they're kind of difficult to differentiate without a good comparative collection. And one day I was surfing out natural bridges, and a piece of kelp floated up onto my leg, and it was covered in these little limpets. I was like, these like high conical limpets. I've been seeing these really small, not mature seaweed limpets, but I've been seeing these in the assemblages that I've been looking through. And, I did a morphometric profile of them, and I was like, this is what I'm seeing. And it was kind of like an aha, wow, we've got this cool proxy for seaweed harvesting that I kind of like accidentally came across. So I'd say it's those. And now anytime I'm out in the water, I'm always scanning feather boa kelp, like, how are the seaweed limpets doing? Even though they're destructive to the kelp over time, and they're kind of parasitic and eat through it and cause it to degrade and erode. I just like them. I don't know if those answers to those questions beg any follow-up, or if those fully answer any of the questions. Anyone want clarification on anything?
Any other questions for Michael? Okay, I don't see any. Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot, and it's really great to see you working with the tribe and contemporary, dealing with contemporary issues and just working together. You know, it's so often it's, you know, archaeologists work kind of with the tribes, but to see you work very integrated is a really wonderful thing, and I appreciate that. Okay, so a couple other comments. They would like the link for the article. Fabulous talk. How do we follow their work? How do we follow your work? And a couple thank yous.
Okay, yeah. Perhaps I could send you a PDF of that paper, because the link might, I think for some folks it will work depending on what you're logged in through, but if I link it through like JSTOR or Google Scholar, it might not be accessible depending on what your email address is or your server info is. So I can send the PDF to you, and perhaps you could distribute it to the folks who signed up.
Yes, yeah, because I have everybody's email address. So yeah, if you could do that, that'd be great. I will send it to everybody, if unless somebody doesn't want it. I don't know.
Yeah, following work. I have a ResearchGate profile that I tend to keep updated, and a number of different kind of projects. That Salmonid biogeography project is like one of the developing projects on there, and I try to keep that updated with papers that I'm publishing. But as I was saying, I'll try to do my best to. I really want to build a cool program. Yeah, I've got one of my colleagues here, Julia Hartman, who is archaeological project leader, who's been hired on working with Santa Cruz State Parks as well, who's helping me and, you know, really guiding me through the collection process in a lot of ways, and kind of making sense of what we have, and ultimately understanding the potential this program has to develop more outreach and volunteer opportunities down the line, you know. So that's something that, as those opportunities come available, I will spread through the Archaeological Society so people can, you know, get updates that way as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if we have no more questions, then we can bid adieu. And thank you again, Michael, for sharing your time with us and presenting your information. So, yay, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Stay safe and dry out there.
Yeah, likewise.
Cheers.